Good morning. Welcome to our lecture on the 1920s. We're going to follow the Bob Jones University Press PowerPoint on Chapter 20 in your textbook. After the war, after World War I, soldiers returned home. Rationing began to be phased out and quickly came to an end. And it seemed that all was a time of prosperity, a time of peace, prosperity, and people were just anxious to get back to what they deemed normal life. So we're going to start out talking about the leadership and just some timeline things that are going to be happening as we go along. I'm going to go through skip over the big ideas and to keep the lecture at a reasonable length. But you have those in your book. Please pay attention to them. Normalcy becomes the goal of people wishing to distance themselves from wartime pressures and problems. Even though the United States had only been in the war for a relatively short period of time, especially when you consider how long the European nations had been in the war and the devastation that the European nations had seen, even though the United States had not suffered such devastation and had not been involved in the fighting for as long, certainly had not seen the enormous number of casualties that the European nations had seen. People were still very desperate, very anxious to get back to what they considered normal life. And normalcy became the theme of the 1920s. Normalcy and this idea of prosperity. Again, I'm going to skip over the guiding questions and big ideas. So, normalcy meant going back to isolationism. They didn't want to be involved in European affairs, issues in Europe for various different reasons. They didn't want to send, Americans did not want to send their soldiers to fight in any foreign wars. So they wanted to get back to isolationism. Leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. They had the idea of an idyllic life. Life is going to be great and wonderful and grand, and there's not going to be any problems. It's a good time in most people's eyes. There's a lot of parties, a lot of social changes, cultural changes are happening, and time. It's just considered an overall good time. But it's all a charade. It's all really overshadowing, not overshadowing, but kind of hiding what's really going on. What people are perceiving is not the reality. And so what they thought of as normalcy, as normal life, was also short-sighted. There were several problems that needed to be addressed, and they weren't being addressed. Some of the post-war problems included war industries closing. During the war effort, jobs had been plenteous, but most of those jobs, or a lot of those jobs, had been in producing items that were necessary for war, whether it was uniforms, bandages, weapons, whatever. These were items that were necessary for war. And a lot of those industries are closing after the war, because there's no need for those products anymore. So unemployment is going to rise. People who had those jobs making those things no longer have jobs. Farming is not going to be profitable anymore. The farmers had already been struggling. They had been struggling since the 1880s in dealing with the railroads and price drops. And one of the problems that the farmers kept having was that the price for a crop would be good for a while, and so they would plant more of that crop because they wanted to cash in on that higher profit. But what sometimes they didn't understand was that the more they produced, that actually caused the price that people were willing to pay for the crop to go lower. It's the law of supply and demand. When the supply is high and the demand is high, then you have an equilibrium price. But as soon as that supply outweighs or goes higher than the demand, people aren't willing to pay that equilibrium price anymore. And so the prices have to start dropping to get people to buy the surplus supply. And when you're dealing with crops, these are things that are not shelf stable. They're not going to last a really long time. So you need to get that money early on. And prices continue to decline after the war. Now, prices had gone up during the war effort because we weren't just trying to feed Americans, we were trying to feed Europeans, we were trying to feed the military. And so for the short time that we were in the war, prices had gone up for farmers, but now they're going to go right back down. And this is going to cause a heavy burden on the farmers. The farmers are not going to have a good decade in the 1920s. So another issue that we had was we discarded emotions. We weren't thinking about, were there other enemies we needed to be preparing for? Were there things that we needed to deal with? There was a small period of time where we looked at communists and anarchists, and we were leery of them. We weren't sure about people who kind of flirted around with these ideas. And there was something called the Red Scare, where bombings, there were some threats of some bombings, or there was at least a rumor. There was this idea that that the Reds, the communists, were going to try and bomb places and things like that. But nothing ever comes about. No, there's no fruition to any of these rumors. And so people just kind of ignore them after a while. If you keep, it's like the boy who cried wolf. When he constantly cried wolf, eventually the people stopped listening to him. Unfortunately, eventually there was a wolf. And so there are problems in the 1920s. When it comes to world relations, when it comes to world relations, we want to go back to being isolated. The United States doesn't want to be involved, especially in European affairs. We want to be isolated, deal with our own issues, maybe keep a hand in the issues that are going on in Latin and South America, but we really don't want to be involved in Europe and in Asia. Now, we did have two foreign policy goals or tasks. We wanted to maintain world peace, and we wanted to stabilize the world economy. But we wanted to do that because that was what was good for us. A stable world economy meant that the United States economy could be stable and could grow. And obviously world peace meant that nobody had to go off to war. So these were two goals that were beneficial to the United States. But the idea behind them wasn't for us to get overly involved in the affairs of other nations. So what did we do to try and pursue this world peace, to try and maintain this world peace? Well, the big thing that we did was the Washington Naval Conference. And the Washington Naval Conference brought together the US, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. And the idea was to limit the growth of naval power. Remember, this is still very early on in the 1900s. Airplanes have been invented and they were used in World War I. And people are seeing their benefits, but they are not going, that right now they're not considered the primary weapon. What is considered the primary threat is a navy. And so the idea is if we can limit the growth of naval power, then we can keep the seas open to everyone, and we can reduce the chances of going to war. And so what the Washington Naval Conference did was it limited naval vessels. It limited the number of battleships, and at the time, battleships were considered the crown jewel of a navy. Later on, by the time we get to World War II, the focus is going to be shifting to the aircraft carrier. But remember, aircraft in the 1920s is still relatively new. It has been used with some success in World War I, but it's not the star player in the military arsenal at that time. The battleship was. And so the idea was, let's limit the number of battleships people can have. Let's limit the number of submarines. For Germany, actually Germany wasn't allowed to have the submarines, and that was part of the Treaty of Versailles. But submarines, as far as the rest of Europe, as far as the Allied powers were concerned, we could have the submarines. They're not as big of a threat. Basically, all the other naval vessels, you could have what you wanted, but you had to limit the number of battleships. Now, the problem with this is that Japan is going to be dissatisfied with the results of the Washington Naval Conference. And to understand why, you have to understand Asian culture. And if you'll notice, most of the members of the Washington Naval Conference are from the Western Hemisphere. It's Britain, France, Italy, and the U.S. All of those nations are from the Western Hemisphere. They have a westernized culture. And Japan, however, is from the Eastern Hemisphere, and their culture has more to do, they highly value honor, and to them, to not be considered an equal player is dishonoring. And even though they were just coming into being highly influential in the world, they wanted to be treated as equals with the U.S. and Britain. So what winds up happening, and your book gives a pretty good explanation of this, but there is a ratio of tonnage of naval ships that each navy can have, and the U.S. and Britain are granted the most. They are granted the most tonnage. France and Italy are granted less than the U.S. and Britain, and Japan is granted less than the U.S. and Britain. Now, France and Italy are okay with that. They recognize they already don't have a huge navy. They weren't planning on building up. So they're okay with the tonnage that they get. But Japan is not. Japan feels slighted. They feel dishonored. And this is really the beginning of tensions between the United States and Japan. And eventually it's going to lead to the Japanese declaring war on the United States in World War II. There's going to be some other things that play into it, but this certainly is the beginning. The next thing we do to work on world peace, or maintaining world peace, is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and this one cracks me up. I cannot believe that enough people actually thought that this was a feasible plan. But Kellogg is from the U.S. This is not the Kellogg of the cereal. He's from the same family, the cereal family, but he's not the two Kellogg brothers who come up with Kellogg cereal. And then Briand is from France, I believe. And they get this idea. They said, wait a minute, we know how to keep war from ever happening again. I don't know why we didn't think of this before. What we're going to do is we're going to make war illegal. And once war is illegal, we can have no more wars. The problem is you can't enforce that. You can't enforce war being illegal unless you're willing to go to war with people who broke the law in the first place. So in order to enforce the law, you have to break the law. It doesn't make sense. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact, it makes a lot of hoopla and splash in the press and the media, and people think that it's a wonderful thing, but really it's nothing. It's a piece of paper. Relationships with Latin America, we actually do get really involved in Latin America. We had already been pretty involved in Latin America under Woodrow Wilson. We're going to get more involved. We're going to intervene in a variety of different countries. But eventually we're going to realize that that's probably not the best course of action, that we're really just stirring up bitterness and resentment in those nations. And so Charles Evans Hughes is going to urge us to withdraw troops from those nations. It's not going to happen quickly, but it will happen. Okay, here is the next thing that is happening in the 1920s, and it's going to continue to happen in the 1930s. And really, this is going to be the beginning of World War II. Some people in Britain, if you ask them when did World War II begin, they will give you the date of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, because these particular provisions are in that treaty, and they set up the perfect economic structure for Adolf Hitler to come into Germany and take over and begin his conquest, or his attempt to conquer Europe. So economic entrapment is what we're calling it. Germany owed reparations. Remember, the whole World War I began between Austria and Serbia, but Germany gets the blame. And Germany has forced to take on the war guilt clause, sign that, and say that it was all their fault, and they have to pay all these reparations. And remember, it was something like, it was $37 million, I think is what it was. I'd have to go back and look at my notes for the exact number. But in today's money, that would be over 400 million, I believe. We might even be up into the billions. I have that written down somewhere in my notes, and I know it was in the World War I lecture. But Germany owes a ton of money. But Germany's infrastructure was destroyed. Germany's economy was destroyed in the war. And the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles really make it difficult for them to rebuild any of that. Yet they still have to pay, primarily Britain and France, all of this money back. At the same time, the European allies, again, primarily Britain and France, owe the United States quite a bit of money. Because remember, even before the United States got into World War I, we were loaning or we were sending aid to the allied, to the alliances, to Britain and France primarily. Now, we sent these things in the form of goods, so weapons. We sent weapons, food, clothing, those kinds of things. Not as many weapons, more food and clothing, but we sent all of those things in goods. But we want to be repaid in cash. Well, again, France and Europe bore a lot of the fighting. France and Britain, many of the nations in Europe, had a lot of the fighting. And their infrastructure was having to be rebuilt. Their economies were having to be rebuilt. They didn't have the cash to pay the United States back. So that was causing a problem. So Germany doesn't have the money that it needs to pay the European nations, primarily France and Britain, back. France and Britain don't have the money that they need to pay the U.S. back. So what happens is this vicious little cycle. The U.S. is going to loan money to Germany. The idea is for Germany to use that money to rebuild its infrastructure and help get its economy going again. But Germany is going to use the money that the U.S. has loaned them to make their reparation payments. So those reparation payments are going to go to the Allies. Now, this is primarily Britain and France. And Britain and France, instead of using that money to rebuild their infrastructure and their economies, they're just going to give that money right back to the U.S. as payment on the loans that the U.S. had made them during the war. So they're really just passing the money around in a circle. Nobody's economy is getting rebuilt. Nobody's infrastructure is getting rebuilt. Nothing is really improving. And it's just going to continue to be a cycle of debt that is going to eventually hurt the world economy. The next thing that's going to be in place is the Fordney-Macomber tariff, and it's a high tariff that the United States is going to put on European goods. And this is going to make it hard for the Europeans to sell goods in the United States. But again, remember, the United States has this isolationist policy, this idea that we want to be an entity unto ourselves. We don't really want to be involved with other nations. And so they're going to make it difficult for Europe to sell goods in the United States. But it's also going to make it difficult for Europe to rebuild their economies. This is going to continue the circular flow that we just talked about until the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan, it says, that, well, wait a minute. There's no way Germany's ever going to be able to repay all that much money. Let's be more reasonable about what they need to repay, and let's reduce those payments. Now, politically, the 1920s are a very conservative time. Very conservative. It's the most conservative time of the 20th century. And remember, when we're talking about politics, conservative just means we don't want things to change. They need to stay the same. We're not going to make any type of reforms. We're not going to make any types of changes. We want to stick with tradition. And so the 1920s are politically the most conservative years of the 20th century. So Harding is the first president during the 1920s. He's helped by Harry Daugherty because the 1920 convention is deadlocked. Daugherty helps him break that deadlock. Harding is able to defeat the Cox-Roosevelt ticket, and yes, this is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Harding is a Republican, so he is going to be elected president. He's going to defeat Cox-Roosevelt, but he's going to have a ton of scandals in his administration. And you can read about some of these scandals in your book. I'm not going to take the time to go into all of them, but one of the big ones was the Teapot Dome scandal. The Veterans Bureau is going to be defrauded of more than $200 million. Remember, this is the 1920s we're talking about, so that's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money today, but it's even more so then. His Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, winds up being brought to trial for bribery. So the man who helped him get the presidency, he becomes the Attorney General, and he winds up, he's supposed to be the nation's lawyer, ensuring that justice is done for all. He winds up being brought to trial for bribery. Harding's a weak president. His character is weak. He doesn't appoint strong officials. He doesn't deal with the misdeeds. He doesn't deal with the mistakes that they make or the problems that they're creating. As soon as they occur, he kind of tries to ignore those, and that hurts his presidency. So then Calvin Coolidge is elected next. Calvin Coolidge decides he's going to investigate the scandals, but he has a hands-off approach to administration. He feels like he's just kind of there to make sure, just kind of oversee things, but he's not supposed to be involved in everything. He doesn't have his hands in everything. The economy and the stock market do well under Coolidge. He's very much that hands-off approach, that laissez-faire approach when it comes to the economy, and the free market does well with that. Calvin Coolidge is known for saying the business of America is business. Coolidge actually promised to only serve one term, and he kept that promise. So the next president is Herbert Hoover. Hoover is elected president. He had been Secretary of Commerce. He runs against Al Smith in the 1928 election. Smith was a Catholic, and Smith opposed prohibition. And remember, prohibition had been passed in the late 19-teens. But Smith opposed prohibition, and he was a Catholic. And at this time in American history, being a Catholic was still very much being in the minority. It was not necessarily a positive thing. People didn't look upon you positively. Hoover was easily won the 1928 election. However, within a year of his election, he won in November of 1928. In October of 1929, the stock market crashes, and we go into a severe economic depression. Hoover does implement some government interventions in the free market. They're rather intrusive. Now, he doesn't do this at first. At first, he wants to let the market correct itself. But he gets a lot of criticism for it because the market is not quick in correcting itself. And so he finally does intervene in the free market. But those interventions are not going to be helpful. They're going to fall flat. The stock market crash was not the result of Hoover's administration, but he does get the blame. I mean, he hadn't even been in office a year when it happens, but he gets the blame and he has to deal with it. And a lot of the reason he gets the blame is because when he does deal with it, it's not a quick fix. But that's the thing with economic issues. There's never a quick fix. We say the stock market crashes, but it doesn't crash all of a sudden. There's a huge buildup to it, and then there's going to be it takes time to get to the point where it can crash, and it's going to take time to recover. Hoover's first reaction is to leave the market alone and let itself correct, which was actually the best option. But again, as I said, he was highly criticized for this because people were genuinely hurting, and they wanted some help. They wanted some relief, and so finally he does interfere. But actually, it's the interference into the free market that prolongs the depression. So let's talk about the culture wars of the time. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time here. Your book does a really good job of explaining these, but this is a time when Darwinism and Marxism are really coming on the scene heavily in the United States. Darwin's theory contradicts the scriptural account of creation. We're talking about Charles Darwin, we're talking about evolution. And we've already seen how Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest deals with or influences imperialism, influences race relations, because his ideas are taken. Some of the things that he actually does observe in nature, survival of the fittest does occur in nature. The strong animals tend to be more dominant. They tend to live longer. Weak, sick animals tend to die quicker. And so survival of the fittest does happen in nature. And Darwin did observe this, but he mistakenly draws conclusions from that about how mankind came into existence. And people take those ideas, those observations, and they continue to draw incorrect conclusions. For example, the idea that Africans are meant to be servants and slaves and live a life of servitude because that they haven't evolved as far as Caucasians have. It's completely not true. It's completely incorrect. But that was one of the ways that Darwinism was twisted. We call it social Darwinism. Marxist economic philosophy denies the depravity of man. Marx had this idea where if everybody owned everything, they would, and everybody was made equal, then mankind would just naturally share everything he had, and everybody would have what they needed. But he doesn't take into account that man is sinful. And these ideas finally get widespread interest in the United States in the 1920s. They had had some interest before, especially in Europe, but they make their way over to the United States in the 1920s and become much more at the forefront. Some of that is due to the immigration that's happening, especially from Eastern Europe, at least in regards to the Marxism. There's a growing disregard of scriptural truth. And because the scriptural truth is being disregarded, it's much easier to accept Darwinism and Marxism. Some other things that are going on at the time, you have Albert Einstein, his theory of relativity. He said that the absolute of science were no longer absolute, kind of. That's how people interpreted it. That's not what Einstein was saying, but that's how people interpreted it. Some used it to cast doubt on the scriptural and moral standards of Americans. Well, if this isn't an absolute, and we always thought that it was, then maybe what you're saying over here, that's not an absolute. That's not what Einstein intended. But That's what people took away from it. Then you have Sigmund Freud, who was an Austrian psychologist, and he argued that self-restraint led to emotional disorders, so you should just be allowed to do whatever you wanted to do. In the literature and art, we see that traditional standards are starting to fade away. Modern standards are going to come into play at the time. Paintings are going to become more abstract. Music is going to change to a tonal type. Themes and techniques are going to focus on things like despair, disillusionment, and meaninglessness. Sounds really uplifting. It's kind of funny that that's what happens during a time that is considered, a party time, a party era. So the next thing that we deal with is prohibition. Prohibition is ratified by the states as an amendment to the Constitution in 1919, but it does not have the effect that was intended. The effect that was intended was to reduce the alcohol consumption, or eliminate really the alcohol consumption that was going on in the United States. The idea was that when people consumed alcohol, they became neglectful and abusive to families. It hurt the economy. It was bad for their health. And so because there was really no positive thing that anybody could think of when it came to the consumption of alcohol, then it should just be outlawed. However, there were some problems that came about with prohibition. Prohibition fails in reducing or eliminating alcohol consumption. However, it does have some successes. It brings about the mafia, speakeasies, and NASCAR. And so basically what happens is there's a ton of illegal activity. That's where this is when the mafia really gets a foothold in the United States. They build their fortune, their power, their influence on being able to supply illegal alcohol during Prohibition. That's where the speakeasies come from. They were speakeasies because when you went up to them, you spoke easy, you whispered to get in. This is where mixed drinks come from. Before Prohibition, you don't have mixed drinks. You had straight beer, whiskey, bourbon, whatever it was, wine. But alcohol is scarce during Prohibition. It's very expensive. It's hard to come by. And so in the speakeasies, they came up with mixed drinks. They would mix a little bit of alcohol with other drinks to make it go farther. I mentioned that it also brings about NASCAR. Well, that's because moonshiners, bootleggers who are producing this illegal alcohol, they have to transport it. Well, it's illegal to transport the alcohol. It's illegal to produce the alcohol. It's illegal to sell the alcohol. It's not illegal to consume it, but you have to be able to find it to consume it. And so the bootleggers have to figure out how to get their alcohol from where they're producing it to where it's going to be sold, or to whoever's buying it, without getting caught by the police. And so they start doctoring up their cars to be able to carry the alcohol in a concealed manner, but also to be able to outrun what they call the revenuers, or outrun the police force. And so in the times that they're not transporting this alcohol, they want to compare their vehicles and see whose goes faster, and NASCAR is born. In 1933, with the passage of the 21st Amendment, Prohibition is repealed. Enforcement was always a problem. It wound up being a much bigger problem than the alcohol had been. The Wickersham Commission found that Prohibition was impossible to enforce because a large part of the nation was willing to violate the law, and therefore it was the recommendation that we get rid of Prohibition. All right, the Roaring 20s. We often hear the 20s referred to as the Roaring 20s, and we hear about all these wonderful things that are going on in the 20s. We see we kind of glamorize the 1920s, and people, when they go to a costume party, they like to dress up like, ladies like to dress up like flappers, which is actually indicative of the fact that most people don't understand the 1920s. There was a breakdown in morality. Divorce rates were going up. Attitudes about morality and fidelity in marriage and things like that were changing. It was becoming actually more socially acceptable to be divorced or to cheat on your spouse. The frivolous and the sensational became very popular. Hymnlines began to rise. Now, we saw hymnlines rise towards the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, but that was a practicality issue. It was more women were being out and about on the streets. The streets were not paved. They were full of mud and animal manure, and so raising up the hymnline a little bit kept the ladies' dresses from getting nasty when they had to go out. But in the 1920s, we see those hymnlines rise all the way to mid-calf. Now, by today's standards, that's not short. But by the standards of that day, that was extremely short. Showing a lady's ankles was really considered immodest. As a matter of fact, when the hymnlines had first started coming up, that's when ladies started wearing boots so that their ankles would still be covered. But by the time that the 1920s come around and those hymnlines start going up, the hymnlines come up to mid-calf and ladies are not wearing boots. So that's considered very risque at the time. Haircuts become shorter. This is when you start seeing the little bob on ladies, and that is considered very very radical for the time. The flapper was actually the floozy of the time. So what we think of as the flapper, she was actually the loose woman of the time. She was very risque, very immoral. It was not somebody to be emulated at the time. So being a flapper was not a compliment. It's kind of funny that that's what the persona we try and take on today. So things were not great, as great as we like to think they were. It was really a time of moral degradation. Heroes and villains, people would keep tabs or could keep tabs on rising stars. There was a lot more print paper out, and movies had become very popular. First, they were silent films, and then towards the end of the 20s, you're going to start getting what they called talkies, or films with where you could actually hear what people were saying. The American Idols at the time were sports heroes, and then your actors from your movies, your silent movies, and then your talkies. And then this is when people really began to start getting obsessed with Hollywood, with actors and actresses. Glamorized them. Some other things that were going on at the time, there was a concern that there were a lot of Roman Catholics and Jewish immigrants coming into the nation. We already talked about the Red Scare of 1919. Black Americans migrated from the South to the North to try and find work because we'd already said farming was not profitable. And most of the Black Americans in the South had been sharecroppers. So there's quite a few things that are going on at the time that are not so great. Part of this, Marcus Garvey comes up with the Universal Negro Improvement Association to try and help the poor blacks. Harlem Renaissance happens. This is a time in Harlem where there's a lot of black intellectuals and writers. You start really seeing black entertainers come up. People, start showing that these African Americans, these black Americans are just as smart, just as intellectual, just as talented, just as capable as their white counterparts. But we're also going to see the revival of the KKK. And part of this is actually going to be the heyday of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan is invented or is birthed in Reconstruction. But it's not going to be anywhere near as influential, anywhere near as effective as it's going to be in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They are looking for 100% Americanism. They have a strong political and social force in northern cities. KKK was not just in the South, it was in northern cities as well. They claimed the cause of moral reform. They said that the problem of the degrading morality in the United States was because we were not 100% American. We had all these we had Catholics, we had Jews, we had blacks, and that was causing a problem morally. And they used violence to express and enforce their message. However, the use of violence, a sex scandal that broke among some Klan leaders in Indiana, those two things combined to actually show that the Klan's so-called moral crusade was really just propaganda. Now, there is a counter movement to the immorality that's going on, and it's called the rise of fundamentalism. This is where Christians believed that theological modernism was a different religion from Christianity. They believed that modernists needed to be removed, and some actually left their denominations and churches and founded new ones. We've seen something similar to this in recent years over issues like transgender, homosexuality, some of the more what we would call liberal movements of today. We've seen denominations split over some of those. The same thing was happening in the 1920s. Some denominations, some churches embraced the new ideas, the ideas of Darwin, the ideas of Marx, the ideas of Freud, these radical social changes, and some churches said no, and so you saw a split. Certain fundamentalist doctrines exist that no one can deny and still be a Christian. That's what they said. And they wrote what's called the fundamentalist essays to make those arguments. I'm actually going to skip this part just for sake of time. Make sure you check it out in your book. I'm going to skip on to the anti-evolution crusade, which is part of the fundamentalist movement. But in the South is where this is mainly going to show up. In the South, evolution is not going to be accepted. They're not going to want it taught. It is very taboo. And some states actually passed laws banning the teaching of evolution in public schools. Tennessee was one of them. This results in the Scopes trial. Now, what winds up happening is really it's kind of set up. There is this little town, Darrows, Tennessee, that when Tennessee passes the law that evolution cannot be taught in their public schools, the ACLU puts out a statement that they are willing to challenge the law in any of these states that pass laws banning evolution being taught. And little Darrow, Tennessee wants to get on the map. They want a name for themselves. And so they decide that, not Darrow, I'm sorry. Darrow is the name of the lawyer. But there's a little town in Tennessee. It does begin with a D. I can't remember what it is though. There's a little town in Tennessee that wants to get on the map, and they're going to use this law to get on the map. And so they go to, actually he's a physics teacher. He doesn't teach biology, so he is a science teacher. He doesn't teach biology. His last name is Scopes. And they get him to agree to basically be the defendant and say that he has taught evolution in school. And what he actually says is that he's used materials that contain evolution. And so there's this trial. Clarence Darrow is the defense attorney. He's pro-evolution or pro-evolution being taught in public schools. William Jennings Bryan, yes, the same William Jennings Bryan who keeps running for president but not winning, he is the prosecution. He's very much anti-evolution. He had really become the face of anti-evolution by that time, and so it was natural that he would become the prosecution. Jennings is going to make a case. It's not going to be the best case. He's going to win. William Jennings Bryan is going to win the Scopes trial, but the way that he makes the case does not give him any support in the public. And so what winds up happening is the public actually come down on the side of Scopes and the teaching of evolution in public schools. And so this just shows that it isn't just in standing up for something that's right that matters. It's the way in which you do it that matters. William Jennings Bryan was standing up for what he believed was right, but the way in which he went about it, the way in which he presented his case, actually hurt the issue more than helped it. There were some successes of the fundamentalists. They had a credible message, and they started a lot of Bible colleges and seminaries. Many of them are still around today. They also started a lot of radio broadcasts, and many of those are still around today. All right, so the last part of the chapter is dealing with what happens. The 1920s are coming to a close. Things are looking great. Things have been going well, or at least that's perception everybody has, and then all of a sudden the bottom falls out from underneath them. What happens? Well, in 1928, Herbert Hoover predicted a total eradication of poverty in the United States. He's running for president. He says he thinks that we are at a point where we can actually eliminate poverty in the United States. Well, everybody's going to want to hear that. Everybody likes that idea. He gets elected as president. One of his slogans, one of his campaign slogans, was a car in every driveway and a chicken in every pot. That was one of the promises that he made. There'll be a car in every driveway and a chicken in every pot. Unfortunately, he's not able to fulfill that promise. He says, we've got the goods. We've got the goods to be prosperous. We've got the goods to get rid of poverty. More automobiles were being made, and people were being able to buy automobiles. Advertising began to happen, and when we're together for our Skype session, we're going to hear some of the advertising and see some of the advertising. People started buying things on installment plans. This is the beginning of credit in the United States. People were able, instead of paying for it all at once, they could take it home and make payments on it. Suburbs came about. People started moving a little bit farther out of the city. Now that they had cars, they didn't have to live so close to their jobs. They could drive in, and so they could drive to the store. So they could move farther out and not have to live in the cramped, crowded, dirty city. And people started touring different places. That became a big industry. Radio became the prized possession. That was the center of entertainment. You could not only listen to music, you'd listen to shows, news, all kinds of things on it. So that was the prized possession if you had a radio. Electrical appliances became much more prevalent. Now, not everybody had them because not everybody had electricity in their home, but that was something to aspire to. You, instead of an icebox, you wanted a refrigerator. Instead of a wood stove, you wanted an electric stove. So those were things that people worked towards. And the telephone had been invented in the late 1800s, and it was becoming more and more popular to have in businesses, certainly, and people wanted to get to the point where they could have one in their home. The United States was on a spending spree. Materialism was running rampant. Some of this was due to advertising. People didn't know that they didn't have things before because there wasn't a lot of advertising. They didn't even know a lot of things existed. Now there was going to be advertising, billboards, ads in magazines, radio advertisements that are going to tell people about all these products that they didn't even know existed, and now they've got to have them. Speculation is going to happen. Speculation is going to happen in real estate, especially in Florida, and in the stock market. It's going to cause a problem. Now, your book says speculation is buying something with the hope of selling it later at a profit. Well, that is a very generic definition. It is a correct definition. But the type of speculation that was going on in the 1920s was not your regular speculation. Like, I'm going to buy this piece of property and put a little bit of investment in it and then sell it later for a profit. That is speculation, but that's not the kind that was going on in the 1920s. In the 1920s, the type of speculation that was going on was taking high risks with little to no knowledge. So there were a few businessmen who knew what they were doing, and they were engaging in high risk speculation because they had the knowledge to know when that risk would pay off and when it wouldn't. But people are they're sheeple, and they would see these few men who knew what they were doing making all this money hand over fist through speculation, and they started trying to speculate. The problem was they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the experience that these other guys did, and it's eventually going to come back to bite them. The market, they would buy stock on the margin, creating a bull market. A bull market, think of a bull with the horns. He just kind of pushes through. He rushes through, and everything's going good. Okay? And that's what's going on in the 1920s. Prices of stocks continue to rise. People are making huge amounts of money. But then the boom goes bust. October 24th, 1929, there's a panic selling. Financiers bought stock to prop up the market. Banks began to pressure brokers. And many tried to sell stock to pay their brokers. In other words, what happens is we're going to get into a bear market. Grin and bear it. The market's going to stall. It's going to drop out. You got to grin and bear through it. Well, what happens here is people get scared. When they start seeing these other guys who know what they're doing start to sell things off, they panic, they get scared, they start trying to sell everything themselves. Banks began to pressure the brokers, so brokers try to sell off stock to get the money to pay the bankers, which just increases the downward spiral. And it's done through emotion, not knowledge, not wisdom, not practicality. October 29th, 1929 is Black Tuesday. It's where the bottom fell out of the market and the market crashed. It's what we call a bear market. So what actually causes the depression? Well, there's a couple of things. The consequences following World War I, that debt cycle we talked about. Germany couldn't pay the reparations. Europe couldn't repay the U.S. loans. The U.S. loans the money to Germany. Germany gives the money to Europe. Europe gives the money back to Germany. So nobody's actually getting ahead. And the U.S. is going into debt. Consumers are going into debt. They're buying things on credit on these installment plans. In other words, they're buying things with money they don't have yet. And unfortunately, the money's not going to come. The Federal Reserve has reckless monetary policies. Things are going well. And so they actually are inflating the money supply. They changed this policy in 1929, but that's not going to help. The tariff of 1930 is going to be huge. It's the highest tariff in American history against the European goods. So that's going to cut off trade with other European countries because the other European countries are going to respond in kind. They're going to put tariffs on American goods. So it's going to hurt everyone. Americans are in debt. They're pessimistic. They're tightening their belts to try and regain their own economic security. In other words, they had been riding high, not preparing for the day that it rained. You know, you've heard older people say, have a rainy day fund. It's preparing for the future. The nature of the market is to go up and come back down. They had been riding the market up, thinking it was never going to come back down. And it did. And it came down hard. Came down harder than it probably had to because of the policies that had been put into place in the 1920s. The buying on credit, the war debt cycle, the lack of saving and really making wise decisions by both the American people and the government when it came to the economy. Hope this has helped you understand the 1920s. Have a great day.